Well, brethren, I know that I think most of us are aware that the nation in which we live, and in fact the entire world in which we live, is becoming increasingly polarized. We certainly see that here in our own country. You read some of the opinion polls and some of the things, and you realize the extent to which we are a very polarized country. They survey various topics. They look at whether it's political trends, and you find that a great deal of the polarization comes down to the attitudes of either a more religious approach or a very secular approach. And you can look whether at the election map of the 2000 elections, you can look at various things, and you'll see is very, very polarized in different camps. And as in terms of those who have a little more of a religious approach and those who have a very secular approach. And of course, even most of those who consider themselves religious, when you really begin to get down to specifics, they have been far more affected by the secular world around them than they realize. And I think that's easy to happen to us as well. This isn't just unique to the United States. That is part of the problem in the state of Israel right now. That is something that has very much been the case in, you look at, over in Britain, you look at the polarization regarding the war, and you look at this very polarized atmosphere that is existing of two camps that are existing inside the same country, that are very antagonistic to one another, very antagonistic in terms of outlook, a very, very polarized approach. We've seen that even here in Texas. In fact, near here up in Mount Pleasant, longtime state senator resigned ahead of time. Had been in office for a number of years, and he said everything has gotten so polarized down in Austin, I just don't want to be down there in the middle of it anymore. You know, I quit. And you see that sort of thing. Now, it's interesting because that polarization and that division has been something that is not unique to just our time. We can find, as we look at certain pivotal points in biblical history, we can find the same. We can find the same thing. Just a week ago, last Sabbath, the Jews ended an observance that is not something that we in the Church of God observe as such, because it's not a holy day. It's not something that is commanded in Scripture. But it was a national occasion that the Jews have observed for over 2,000 years. In fact, Jesus Christ himself took note of it. It's mentioned in the Gospel of John, chapter 10. It was a national holiday. We might compare it in some ways to the 4th of July or Thanksgiving Day. In John chapter 10 and verse 22, we read that it was at Jerusalem, the Feast of Dedication, and it was winter, and Jesus walked in the temple there in Solomon's porch. Now, the Feast of Dedication is the translation into English. The name by which this particular holiday is better known is actually by its Hebrew name, Hanukkah. Now, it was a it was a festival that celebrated the rededication of the temple. And the events that surrounded both the desolation of the temple and its rededication and the things that occurred really set the stage for the world of the New Testament. So a lot of times we don't stop to think that where the Old Testament ends, if you look at the last things that are written, where the book of 2 Chronicles ends, where the books of Ezra and Nehemiah sort of pick up that story and where they end. You can look at the prophets like Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, that basically the story ends about 400 years before Jesus was born. Now let me ask you the question. The 400 years between the end of the book of Malachi and the beginning of the book of Matthew, is that mentioned in Scripture? You know, 400 years is a long time. You go back 400 years ago, and you're back at the time of really, just about the time of the first English-speaking settlement here in the United States, Jamestown Colony. That was right at the beginning of the 1600s, about almost 400 years ago. A lot of things happened in 400 years. If you want to look back to 400 years ago, the beginning of the 1600s, and look at what has transpired in this country since that time, you say, well, boy, an awful lot is packed into 400 years. All right, the events that occur between the time that the Old Testament ends and the time that the New Testament begins is a period of 400 years. An awful lot of things happened during that 400 years. The world of the New Testament, the world of Jesus and the apostles, was a world that came into being as a result of the things that had happened in those previous centuries. Is the Bible completely silent about that period in between? Well, there were no books of the Bible that were written during that 400-year period. There was from the, let's say, the death of Malachi until the coming of John the Baptist, there was no recognized prophet in Israel. It's sort of interesting. The Jewish historian Josephus testifies of that. He writes about the books that the Jews esteem in terms of the books of the canon, and he was writing as a response to someone who was a Gentile author who was making fun of the Jews and had made a number of derogatory comments. And Josephus, a priest and historian who was basically contemporary with the story in the book of Acts, wrote a book, where he wrote several books, and one was entitled Against Appian. Appian was this Greek, actually an Egyptian, Greek-speaking Egyptian who had written this attack on the Jews. And Josephus makes the point in there. He says, now look, we don't have many different contradictory books like the Greeks do that are all contradicting one another. He said, we've got a set of books. We've got 22 books, which is the way the Jews counted the books of the Old Testament. Some of the books that we consider multiple books, they counted as one, like 1st and 2nd Chronicles were counted as one book. The book of Chronicles just divided in two for, let's say, 2 volumes of the same book. Anyway, they had a particular way of counting. He says, we've got these 22 books that we esteem to be sacred, that we esteem to be holy. He said, now, and they haven't been added to since the days of Artaxerxes. Now, Artaxerxes is mentioned in the book of Ezra. He's the one that actually issued the decree allowing Ezra and Nehemiah to go back and to rebuild the city. Zerubbabel had gone back earlier and rebuilt the temple, but it was under the guidance of Nehemiah that the walls of the city were actually rebuilt. So that is the ending point of the Old Testament. Josephus said, we've had a lot of books written since the days of Artaxerxes, but none of them are esteemed sacred or holy. None of them are put in the category of these special books because there have not been any prophets since that time. Malachi was the last of the prophets. And until John the Baptist came on the scene, there was not a recognized prophet among the Jews. But there was a lot of activity. We know the way this story ends up when you look at it. But you know, the Bible, though there are no books that were written during that time, the Bible does not leave that period of time as a blank. You know, prophecy and history are the same thing, just seen from different perspectives. If you're looking forward, it's prophecy. If you're looking backward, it's history. A lot of what we consider prophecy, you know, a lot of prophecies that were made in the Old Testament are already history. Prophecies that related to Christ's first coming. Prophecies that he would be born in Bethlehem. Prophecies that were fulfilled by Jesus when he was here for the first time. Well, that's already history. There are things that are prophecies of the years immediately ahead of us. Prophecies about the future. Prophecies about the second coming of Christ. You know, it's just a matter of a few years to those things are going to be history. You think about that? You know, it's not that many years in the future that, you know, little kids, when they're learning history, are going to be studying about the things that you and I are anticipating. They're going to be looking back and being told the story of the things that happened here and the things that happened there. It'll already be history. It'll be history. Daniel was taken into captivity as a young man, the very beginning of the downfall of Judah, when Nebuchadnezzar invaded Judea 3 different times. The first time was just at the time when he first took the throne. And he came in and he made Judea a tributary state. They had to pay certain taxes and certain tribute to Babylon. And one of the things that he did was he seized a number of the young men of prominent families and hauled them off to Babylon. Daniel was a young man, teenager, at that time. And Daniel had a lengthy period of public service, and not only a time of public service, but a time when God certainly worked with Daniel, worked through Daniel, used Daniel in a very noted way. And it was a number of decades. From the time we pick up the story at the beginning of the book of Daniel until you get to the very end of the book of Daniel during the beginning of King Cyrus's reign, there was a period of between about 65 and 70 years that went by. So Daniel was in his mid to late teens at the beginning of the book, and he was, his mid to late 80s. He was about Dr. Torrance's age by the time of the end of the book of Daniel, somewhere around 85 or 86 as you put the story together. Now, over the course of that long life and that active ministry that he had, God gave to Daniel a remarkable set of visions. And those visions picked up the story during Daniel's day, and they described the future, all the way down to the time ahead of us when Jesus Christ is going to return and set up the kingdom of God. You know the story. In the beginning, while Daniel was still quite a young man, just shortly after he'd come to Babylon, you have the account mentioned in Daniel chapter 2, where Nebuchadnezzar had a dream and no one could interpret it, and finally Daniel was brought in. And that story is given in Daniel 2. We've gone over it a number of times, the image, and it had, of course, the gold, the silver, the brass, the iron, and representing, as Daniel explained to King Nebuchadnezzar, 4 kingdoms that would successively appear on the world scene and would culminate with the destruction of that image, the destruction of those kingdoms, and the God of heaven setting up a kingdom that would never fall. Well, many years later, recorded in Daniel chapter 7, this is the first year of Belshazzar. Belshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. He held the throne as a co-ruler with his father Nabonidus, who was actually the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar. This would have been just a few years before the fall of Babylon. And here, by this time, Daniel 7, the first year of Belshazzar, Daniel would have probably been approaching 80 years of age. He would have been in his late 70s, close to 80. And it was at this point that he had a dream. And many things about the dream, as Daniel came to understand it, harkened back to what he had seen as a young man about 60 years earlier. Now, the initial thing that Daniel saw was very different. He saw it was this night, and he saw like a stormy sea. The wind was blowing, and the waves were rising and falling and choppy, and then he saw these creatures coming up out of the sea, appearing successively. He saw first creature came up, but these were strange-looking creatures. He saw a lion, looked like a lion, but it had wings. Had eagle's wings. Now, you don't see too many lions with wings, so, Daniel sees this creature coming up, and then he saw another creature, a bear this time. This one looked a little more normal. He had 3 big ribs in his mouth. Looked like he just finished dinner. And he comes up out of the sea. And then he sees a leopard. Now, the leopard is really a strange-looking creature because the leopard has 4 heads. And this comes up out of the sea. And then he sees a 4th creature that is different than the others. In fact, it's so terrible looking that Daniel can't even describe it by saying, well, it looked like this animal or that animal. He describes it as this terrible looking creature, and it had big iron teeth, and it came up, and he describes that, and then he sees in verse 9 these thrones cast down and the Ancient of Days sitting. His garment was white like snow. This is Daniel 7:9. The hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was like a fiery flame. And it describes this, this scene of judgment. And Daniel describes in verse 13, seeing one like the Son of Man, coming in the clouds of heaven, coming before the Ancient of Days. And there was given to him, verse 4, dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. Daniel was, as he says, grieved in my spirit. The visions of my head troubled me. He woke up and he had this vivid memory of what he had seen. And it was overwhelming to him. And so Daniel wants to know the interpretation. And he is told, verse 17, these great creatures, which are four, represent four kings or four kingdoms that will arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High will take the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Now this harkens back to what Daniel had seen in Daniel chapter 2, or what he had explained. In Daniel 2, it was Nebuchadnezzar that had the dream. And the symbolism was different, but the interpretation was four kingdoms. And in the days of the final kingdom, the God of heaven set up a kingdom that would never be removed. Here, Daniel again sees, this time symbolized by animals, but he sees these four kingdoms, and then he sees that ultimately the God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom. The saints of the Most High will take the kingdom and possess it. Daniel wanted to know a little more about this fourth king, this fourth beast, because it was, he was told in verse 23, the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon the earth. It'll be different than the others and devour the whole earth, tread it down, break it in pieces. So Daniel wants insight, and he's given a certain amount of insight as he sees this progression from his days, starting in the days of Babylon, because remember, the beginning of the vision, as explained in Daniel 2, Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar, you represent this head of gold. So you start with Nebuchadnezzar. And there was to be a succession of empires. Now, years have passed. Nebuchadnezzar is dead. His grandson is the one who is holding court there in Babylon. Daniel has this other dream that uses different symbols and therefore brings in different details. Now, 2 years later, chapter 8, verse 1, in the third year of the reign of Belshazzar. So a couple of years after Daniel has seen this vision, it's recorded in Daniel 7, he saw another vision. And what he saw, standing on a riverbank, he saw a ram standing there by the river. Verse 3, this ram had two big horns. And one horn was a little higher than the other. It was a little bigger than the other. It was a little bit, unusual looking in that way, but it was somewhat of a normal looking ram, big, powerful ram. And the ram, verse 4, pushed to the west and to the north and to the south, and none of the other creatures could stand before him. He just did whatever he wanted to. And as Daniel is watching this ram, behold, verse 5, a goat came from the west. And it came flying across the face of the earth. It was moving so fast it was like his feet didn't even touch the ground. Now this is an odd-looking goat because he only had one horn. And it came up from between his eyes. Now, you probably haven't seen any goats that look like that. I don't know that I have. One big horn coming out from between its eyes. This goat comes running across from the west. And when he got to where the ram was, the ram with two horns standing there, big, powerful ram, he's been chasing all the other animals around. Here comes this goat flying across the earth, jumps into the ram, hits the ram, knocks the ram down, stomps on the ram. Poor old ram, he's finished. And, now this goat is standing there. Well, the next thing Daniel sees is the horn, this big horn that pops out from the goat. The horn is broken off. And where that big horn was, 4 other horns came up in its place. Now, this is described, and out of one of those horns, one of those 4, verse 9 says, a little horn came out of that one. He waxed exceeding great toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land. That would be a reference to the land of Israel. It waxed very great, became very great, even to the host of heaven, or to the people of God. It cast down some of the host and magnified itself, even to the prince of the host, verse 11, and by him, speaking of this little horn, the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And a host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, cast down the truth to the ground, practiced and prospered. And I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint, How long? How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? And he said unto me, Unto 2,300 days is the way the King James and a number of other English translations render it. But that sort of obscures the point, because the word in verse 14 is not the Hebrew word for days. In fact, there are two words. What it actually says, literally, and the Jewish translation brings this out, and a few others do, unto 2,300 evenings and mornings shall the sanctuary be then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Well, now, a lot of the translators, when they looked at 2,300 evenings and mornings, they said, well, evening and morning is a day, simpler to say day. Well, if it meant day, he would have said day, and there's a reason why he didn't. Daniel, when he saw the vision, sought for meaning. He wanted to understand it. And he was trying to understand. So, verse 20, he was told that the ram that he had seen, the one with the two horns, that represented the kings of Media and Persia. And the rough goat, verse 22, or verse 21, the rough goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now, it's interesting because what we are proceeding through right here is the story of what happened between the Testaments. You see, when Daniel was brought to Babylon and the people of Judah were taken into captivity, the Babylonian Empire reached a height during the time of Daniel's time in Babylon. But even at a time when Babylon was achieving its greatest power and its greatest strength, the God of heaven was able to declare in advance, Babylon is going to pass from the scene. Babylon isn't going to endure. What Nebuchadnezzar is building is not going to last. There's going to arise a second kingdom that'll take that place. Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that at a time when Nebuchadnezzar was still on the way up. Daniel actually lived to see that transition from Babylon to Persia. That's recorded in Daniel chapter 5. I won't go there, but it's a story that I think most of us are very familiar with. You remember the handwriting on the wall. Belshazzar's having a big drunken bash, big celebration. The handwriting on the wall, Daniel comes in and tells him this very night, your kingdom is going to be taken by the Medes and the Persians. Sure enough, even as they were speaking, the Medes and the Persians were making the beginnings of actually entering Babylon secretly. They had diverted the Euphrates River, and under cover of night, when the water level dropped, they brought troops underneath the wall, which they couldn't go through. If you can't go through it, well, go some other way. They went under it, came under it, unlocked the gate. The army marched in. So Daniel actually lived to see the transition from the first kingdom to the second kingdom, from Babylon to Persia. Now here in vision, he is given the story, and he sees these creatures. Well, he sees this ram, the two horns that stood for the union of Media and Persia. But that wasn't going to last either. And he's told that the goat that comes, the one that's going to destroy it, is Greece. Well, we know from history that's exactly what happened. 200 years, approximately, just over 200 years after the fall of Babylon, sure enough, Alexander the Great, rising in the west in Greece, came across the Hellespont into Asia Minor, defeated the armies of the Medes and the Persians, and he set up a kingdom that stretched all the way south to Ethiopia, all the way east into India and Afghanistan. Vast empire. But it didn't last long, because just as it was said here, you see, the great horn between the eyes, that represents the first king, and being broken, 4 kingdoms are going to stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. This is Daniel 8:22. Well, we know from history that's exactly what happened. Alexander died at the height of his power, and his kingdom within a few years had been divided among 4 of his generals, just like Daniel said in advance. You know, Daniel records some of the most detailed prophecies. He's one of the writers of the Old Testament that the critics try to go after the most. And the reason they try to undermine Daniel and say, well, Daniel didn't know, Daniel wasn't written by Daniel. You know the reason they say that, don't you? Because the only alternative is that there's a God in heaven who can write history in advance. So you either have to say that the book of Daniel stands as one of the clearest proofs of the inspiration of the Bible, or you have to say, well, Daniel was written, it was written way later. It was written hundreds of years after it claimed to be written. Well, too many things that disprove that. But Daniel foresaw what happened. The kingdom of Greece, the Greek realm, was going to be divided among 4 generals. And he describes that. 4 kingdoms would stand up out of the nation, because even though you had Ptolemy down in Egypt and Seleucus up in Babylon, and you had Cassander and Lysimachus over in Greece and up in Asia Minor, they all were Greeks. They all spoke Greek. They all shared in certain ideas of what's called in the history books Hellenism, which simply means the culture, the philosophy, of the Greeks. Because while we use the word Greek, the Greeks don't use the word Greek. The nation of Greece to this day doesn't call itself Greece; it calls itself the Hellenes. That's the term that they use for themselves. And anyway, the Greek language, the Greek culture, Hellenism, was spread all over the Near East. One of the interesting results of that is that's what made it possible for the New Testament to be written in Greek. Because that was a language that people all over spoke. Even though Latin was the official language of Rome and of the Roman Empire, in the days of the New Testament, every educated person in Rome spoke Greek, because that's what the teachers were imported from Athens, and they're the ones that taught the schools, and you had to learn Greek. Greek was widely spoken. It was a language of commerce. It was a language that virtually everyone over most of the Mediterranean world and going on east of there spoke. And so what it provided was a language, a common language in which the New Testament was written. Now, Daniel then goes on here in Daniel chapter 8, and he's told in verse 23 that in the latter time of their kingdom, of this Greek realm, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. His power shall be mighty. He will, verse 25, cause craft to prosper in his hand. And now, if you come on down here in Daniel chapter 8, it becomes apparent that this individual that was going to come up out of the Greek realm is really a type of somebody else who would ultimately stand up, the end of verse 25, against the prince of princes and would be broken without hand. Well, Daniel certainly wanted to understand all of these things, and we're going to look at some more details of this fulfillment. Well, a few years later, just a very short time after Daniel had recorded what's written in Daniel 8, which is dated in the 3rd year of Belshazzar, here in chapter 9, the 1st year of Darius. Remember when Belshazzar was overthrown, Darius the Mede was appointed king in Babylon, served for 2 years until King Cyrus returned. Okay, this is the beginning. This is right after the fall of Babylon, the events in Daniel chapter 9. Daniel is wanting to understand the prophecies that Jeremiah had written about 70 years in the desolation of Jerusalem. Now, Jeremiah had made prophecies back before Judah went into captivity that they would serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Well, Daniel really wanted to understand what that meant, because the dating of Daniel chapter 9 is right after the fall of Babylon. So, King of Babylon has fallen, Judah's still in captivity. Jeremiah had made a prophecy they'd serve the king of Babylon 70 years, so the king of Babylon is gone. What's going to happen next? Daniel really wanted to understand that. He began to really seek God through fasting and prayer, as it mentions here in verse 3. He went to God, he made confession, he acknowledged that what had happened to Judah they had deserved, but he really appealed to God for his mercy. And so finally Gabriel appears to him in chapter 9, verse 21, and begins to explain something actually that's a little different than what Daniel had asked. Daniel wanted to understand the 70 years that Jeremiah had prophesied, and instead, verse 24, he's told about 70 weeks. A different prophecy that stretches from a time when the city a decree would be issued to rebuild the city on down to the time of the Messiah. Well, a few years later, chapter 10, verse 1, in the third year of Cyrus. So we're talking of a period about 4 years after chapter 9. The third year of Cyrus, Daniel had been, again, fasting and praying, really seeking God. And he is given a vision. An angel comes, and he says in verse 14 of Daniel 10, "Now I am come to make you understand what shall befall your people in the latter days. For yet the vision is for many days." And Daniel is going to be given information. So he harkens back in chapter 11 how in the first year of King Darius he had stood up to help him out and to try to serve him. And he said, here's the truth. There's going to stand up yet, verse 2, 3 kings in Persia. The fourth will be richer than they all. And he connects up the history of Persia and Greece. And he talks about this mighty king. You remember Daniel had the vision. He'd seen it as animals, a ram and a great he-goat. Now he's told by the angel, a mighty king shall stand up from Greece that's going to rule with great dominion. He'll stand up, verse 4, and his kingdom will be broken and be divided toward the 4 winds. Remember, Daniel had seen in vision the horn broken off and 4 horns. Now he's told by the angel. And then, beginning in verse 5, 2 of those 4 kings, the 4 that sprang up in Alexander's aftermath, that are identified. They're called the king of the south and the king of the north. There are only 2 that the Bible discusses because there are only 2, Ptolemy to the south and Seleucus to the north, that had anything to do with Jerusalem. And that's where the prophecies center, on Jerusalem. And so Daniel 11 then begins one of the most detailed prophecies in the Bible, going through the story of this wrangling between the Seleucids in the north and the Ptolemies in the south. And we come down through this story, and we see these kings trying to do various things, and you can track it. Most commentaries will give you a pretty accurate version of Daniel 11 in terms of just the history of what's going on back and forth. And he describes this, and he describes down in verse 28 about one of the successor kings of the king of the north, whose heart, verse 28, would be against the holy covenant. He'll do exploits and return to his own land. And how he'll come back toward the south. And the ships of Kittim. Kittim was an ancient name for Sicily, and was the headquarters of the Roman fleet. That they would come and would not allow him to progress any further. He would return, verse 30, and have indignation against the holy covenant. He shall even return, have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. Arms shall stand on his part. They'll pollute the sanctuary of strength, take away the daily sacrifice, place the abomination that makes desolate. And such as do wickedly against the covenant will be corrupt by flatteries, but the people that know their God will be strong and do exploits. Now, that's an interesting story, because that is exactly what the Persians ruled. As Daniel saw the beginning of that, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah tell about the return of the Jews to rebuild Jerusalem during the early days of the Persian kingdom. But it ends, the The book of Malachi ends a little over 100 years, about 130 years or so after the fall of Babylon. The Persian kingdom has, quite a number of years to go, has over 70 years yet ahead when the Old Testament ends. But Daniel records what's going to happen. God inspired him to write ahead of time that the Persian kingdom would fall to the Greeks, and that the Greek realm would split in terms of its political unity, but it would maintain its religious and its cultural unity. They would all stand up out of the same nation, and yet it would be fractured politically. And that two of those successor states were going to be concerned with Jerusalem, one located north of it, one located south of it. And the one located in the north was going to come in and try to conquer the one in the south, which is exactly what happened. The Seleucids kept trying to come down into Egypt, and of course, in order to get to Egypt, you had to go through Jerusalem on the way down. And sure enough, he got down there, and he was just on the verge of conquering the whole thing, and the Roman fleet showed up and said, buddy, we think you better go back home. We don't want you getting too big and too powerful. That occurred in a period of about 170 B.C. To a king from north of Jerusalem whose name was Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes was the title that he hung on himself. It means basically of the glorious appearing. He considered himself, and he hung this title on himself, claiming to be God manifest. He had sort of an inflated idea of his own importance. Well, the Romans wouldn't let him stay in Egypt any longer. He went back through. Now, you know what happened? You've heard the old story about the guy that gets yelled at the office, and he goes home and yells at his wife, and she yells at the kid, and the kid kicks the dog and sort of passes it on down. Well, he couldn't do anything in Egypt. He was afraid of the Romans. The Romans wouldn't let him finish off Egypt. So he had to go back home. Well, he had to pass Jerusalem on the way back. And he didn't like Jews to begin with, and he liked them even less now because he was mad. He wanted somebody he could kick around. And one of the reasons that the Jews were hated by him was because he looked at the Jews and he said, our whole realm would be united if it weren't for these Jews. They're the odd man out. They don't support Greek religion and Greek culture. They don't fit in. It's interesting. From the days of Nimrod, man has tried to build one world. He's tried to do it his own way. Well, Alexander the Great, he had a concept of one world. In fact, what he wanted his soldiers to do was intermarry, or they didn't even have to marry, just have kids by all the women along the way. He wanted to create one group of people, one race of people, one language of people, one religion, one culture, one everything. By the way, that's where a lot of the Afghans come from. You read the story. They are the descendants of they killed men, and then the Alexander the Great's soldiers. These were the offspring of his soldiers and the women there in that area. That's as far as his kingdom went, and they've loved nothing else better than to fight ever since. They are true sons of Alexander. But you look at this sort of thing. The Jews didn't fit in. The Jews, or at least, I say the Jews didn't fit in. You see what happened by this time, and it's alluded to here in Daniel 11, that the Jews had split into two camps. There were Jews who did want to fit in. They wanted to be a part of this Hellenistic realm. And so what did Antiochus do when he came back? Well, verse 30 says, he shall return and have intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant. When he came back through, there were two brothers, one of whom was the high priest, and the other, of course, was the brother of the high priest. Well, the fellow who was the high priest's brother was a political sort, and he was one who really was enamored of Hellenism. He told Antiochus, he said, look, I will pay you. I'll give you, X amount of money if you will appoint me high priest. Kick my brother out, put me in there. Well, Antiochus was glad to do that. You give him money, so he kicked the brother out and put the other fellow in. The other fellow said, look, you put me in, and I'm willing to go along with all these things you want. We'll just bring the rest of the Jews into tow. Well, there was trouble, there was strife. One of the problems was Once you put the office up for bid, then somebody else came along who wasn't even related to the high priest, wasn't even of the tribe of Levi. He said, I'll pay you more than he did. Antiochus said, the job's yours. So all of a sudden you're going through high priest because now the job's up for sale. And Antiochus then said, I've had enough of trying to pacify these Jews. We're going to put a stop to it. So right after the Feast of Tabernacles in, Feast of Tabernacles of 167 A.D., he issued a decree that required the sacrifices to stop at the temple in Jerusalem. A few weeks later, he had troops show up, and they marched into the temple, and they set up this statue of Jupiter Olympus. They said, we're going to, now this is going to be the temple of Jupiter. They took a pig and offered it on the altar there in the temple, and they began offering sacrifices to this idol of Jupiter Olympus. That went on for a period of just over 3 years. And they began this systematic enforcement. They issued a law, said it's now illegal to circumcise boy babies. We want every copy of the Scriptures that can be found. We want them brought here, and we're going to burn them. And from now on, everybody is expected to work on the Sabbath. There's not going to be any taking Saturday off. And we're going to, for the sacrifices, we're going to offer pigs. Everybody's expected to come up and take a bite. And so they started this process. And one of the first places they went was a little village near Jerusalem. And they came in, they called everybody together, and they announced what the program was, and they set up their idol, and they brought their pig, and they went through the whole thing, and there was an elderly man there who was a priest. He was the most respected man in the community, so they called him. They said, okay, you're the one that everybody looks to. You're sort of the leading man here. You're a priest. We want you to come first. And then everybody line up and come behind you. Well, he refused. His name was Matthias, and he said, absolutely not. Well, there's always one in every crowd who sees an opportunity to sort of advance himself. So sure enough, there was a volunteer. I'll do it. Some guy comes running up to the front. He's ready to get first in line, get in good with a new crowd. Old Matthias is so angry and so furious when he sees this guy going to go up and do this, that he grabs a sword and runs up there and cuts the fellow's head off, which sort of put a stop to the festivities. And then he tied into the soldier that was standing there, and the next thing you know, his sons grabbed their swords, and there weren't very many soldiers there, so they killed the whole bunch. And at that point they realized, there are more soldiers coming, so they took off for the hills. That was the beginning of what's called the Maccabee revolt. Maccabee, one of the sons of Matthias, was one of his sons was named Judas Maccabee. Maccabee was his nickname. Maccabee meant the hammer. So he was known as Judas the Hammer. And that's what he did. He hammered away on these fellows. And there began what's called the Maccabee revolt. Lasted for a little over 3 years. Matthias died early on, and his son Judas, called Judas Maccabee, led the revolt to a successful conclusion. And sure enough, they retook the citadel in Jerusalem, took the temple proper, and they took the altar that had been used for pagan sacrifice, and they got rid of that and put a new altar, rededicated it, took the idol out, destroyed that, and rededicated the temple to the God of heaven. Now, the interesting thing, when you go through and you count historically, you remember we read this prophecy. Daniel was told that there would come 2,300 evenings and mornings. Do you know what happened in the temple every evening and every morning? A sacrifice was made, right? There were morning and evening sacrifices. Interestingly, from the date that Antiochus issued his decree to stop sacrificing in the temple of Jerusalem right after the Feast of Tabernacles, up until the temple was rededicated, there were exactly 2,300 evening and morning sacrifices that weren't offered, right to the day. Works out to being about 1,150 days. But there were 2,300 evening and morning sacrifices that were not offered because either it was stopped entirely or there were pagan sacrifices being offered. So needless to say, when the temple was rededicated to God, that was a time of great celebration among the Jews. That occurred here in approximately December of 164 BC. So about 160 years before the birth of Christ, this event had occurred, and it was what Jesus had come up to Jerusalem to take part in the festivities celebrating this feast of dedication. But you know, that didn't end the story. Now, Daniel goes through and he tells the story in advance. He talks about polluting the sanctuary, verse 31 of Daniel 11, taking away the sacrifice, placing the abomination that makes desolate. This is referring to this idol. And then he says, such as do wickedly against the covenant will be corrupt by flattery. The people that know their God will be strong and do exploits. There was this dichotomy, this split, because there was a very substantial part of the Jewish community that really wanted to go along with Hellenism. In fact, many of the leaders, many of the priests, the better educated, they read these things, they were enamored of these ideas. Many of them bought into it. The priesthood then became for them simply a means of status, a means of power, a means of money and control of others. But it didn't mean that they really deeply believed and trusted God. The revolt led by the Maccabees primarily attracted people that were, there were others, just as there were those who wanted to fit in and be part of this new one world, this Hellenistic system. There were others who were infuriated by it. They didn't want any part of it, and they joined in the revolt. Well, eventually, the Maccabee family took the high priesthood. Actually, one of Judah Maccabee's brothers took the high priesthood, had it for several years, for a period of about 20, a little over 20, between 20 and 30 years. He died, and his brother, he had another brother that took that priesthood, and he held it for a number of years, bringing us all the way down to about 100 years before the time of Christ. And he died, and he had a son, that came in. One of Matthias's grandsons inherited the high priesthood. His name was Alexander, and by his time, he called himself not only high priest to the Jews, but he called himself their king as well. And they had won political independence from the Greeks, but there was trouble stirred up. Because you see, even this family, once it had gotten the priesthood and a little time went by and the older generation died and the younger generation came along, well, it was a means of status, it was a means of political control, it was a matter of money, and they lost the respect of the people, and the people were still divided. There were those who bought into a very secular view, and there were those who were much more religiously intent. In fact, those who were really religious called themselves, they had a name for themselves, they called themselves the separated ones. They were different. They weren't a part of this Hellenistic one world. They were the separated ones. The name in Hebrew was Pharisee. They were the separated ones. Now, there were another group, in fact, the ones who increasingly, most of the priestly family, that called themselves ironically, after the name of one of their ancestors, who was a very notable man. His name was Zadok, and they called themselves a name that was taken from that, spelled out in English as Sadducee. Now, when you read in the New Testament, you read about the ones who came to Jesus trying to trip him up. Well, you read about the Pharisees, and you read about the Sadducees, and you read about the Herodians. Well, you see, about 70 B.C., Alexander died. The priest, the last of the Maccabee priests, and his widow came to the throne, and she held the throne for a period of time, and eventually she held the throne. She couldn't hold the high priesthood. She put her son in as high priest, and he was utterly corrupt. Nobody respected him. And when he died, by this time, a different situation was ready to come about. You see, all sorts of political intrigues had gotten in there, and when the Jews were having trouble with the Greeks, they decided that the solution was to make a political alliance. And so they sent a group of people, sent a delegation to Rome. About 70 A.D., sent a delegation to Rome and said, look, we would like to make a treaty of friendship. You don't like the Greeks, and we don't either. We'd like to be friends. The Romans said, oh, we're happy to be friends. Here, just sign on the dotted line. Well, sure enough, a few years later, when there was strife, two of the claimants to the priesthood, two brothers, were squabbling. The Romans said, you know, this is really terrible. We don't want brothers fighting. We'll come in and we'll settle the problem. We'll arbitrate. We're friends, right? Well, they found out some friends, you know, in a treaty of friendship with the Romans, some friends are more equal than others. And so the Romans solved the problem. They showed up, and the next thing you knew, Judea wasn't independent anymore. It was brought into the arms of the Roman Empire. And there was a fellow by the name of Herod, who wasn't even a Jew. He was actually an Edomian, an Edomite. He'd gone to Rome, and he talked to the Romans, and they said, okay, and the Roman Senate proclaimed Herod king of the Jews. And Herod came back, and he managed. Herod was, I'll tell you, he was an adept fellow, because the Romans were having their trouble between Julius Caesar and Brutus and Mark Antony and all the various factions that were fighting. Ultimately, of course, Julius Caesar was assassinated, and his nephew Augustus came and took control. Herod managed to jump from one side to the other. He was, I don't know if he had opinion polls or what, but he always seemed to know which side was winning, and just about the time they won, he jumped over. That was the side he was on. You know, he'd have been, a lot of politicians today try to take lessons from Herod. They look up to see which way the train is moving to know which direction they want to go. And Herod, who had been proclaimed by the Romans as king of the Jews, now is ensconced in power. He marries the widow of the last Maccabee high priest. Well, you know, there are folks that ally with Herod. They just want to be in good with the guy in charge. And so when you come into the New Testament, Jesus warned his disciples, beware the leaven of the Pharisees, beware the leaven of the Sadducees, and beware the leaven of the Herodians. Well, the origin occurred just in those years previous. Herod came to the throne just almost 40 years before the birth of Jesus. That's why he was so shaken up. See, the Roman Senate, the title that they gave him was King of the Jews. That's why Herod was so shaken up when one day this great delegation from the east who had crossed the Euphrates, and they showed up, all their camels and their great entourage, and they showed up in Jerusalem. They came to the palace, and they were brought in to see the king. These, you know, this powerful delegation from the east. And they were brought in, and their question to Herod, they said, we've come to see the one who has been born as King of the Jews. That was the title they used. Well, that was what shook Herod so much, because that was the title. He wasn't born King of the Jews. He got his from the Roman Senate. And they said, we've come to worship the one who has been born as King of the Jews. So Herod immediately calls in all of the religious leaders, the priests, the scribes, and he says, I want to know where the Messiah is going to be born. And they quoted the verse out of Micah, and they said, Bethlehem. Herod told the wise men, you remember the story, he says, okay, you go find him, worship him, and I want to worship him too. Be sure you come back and tell me where you find him. Of course, God sent word to the wise men and said, don't go back and tell Herod anything. You better leave, head out the other direction. This set the stage. When you read in the New Testament, you read about the Sadducees. You read about people who really didn't believe much of anything. You remember we're told in the New Testament that the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in the spirit realm. They were the skeptics, the intellectuals. They had bought into Greek philosophy. They may have been in a religious office, but that didn't mean they really believed much. The Pharisees, on the other hand, who came to power as the ones who were against fitting in and being part of this new system. Well, religion had for them, for so many of them, become sort of a hollow shell. They were self-righteous, they were judgmental, they looked down on others. And then the Herodians, they were just in sort of, they wanted to be with the winning side. One group had a religious orientation, but it was a self-righteous, judgmental attitude toward others. One had an intellectual orientation. They didn't really believe much. They were smarter. They thought they were smarter than everybody else. Pharisees figured they were better than everybody else. Sadducees thought they were smarter than everybody else. And the Herodians just wanted to be on the winning side. They wanted to be allied with who had the money and the power. And, they weren't against religion. The Herod family wasn't against religion. You remember, one of the Herods wanted to see Jesus. Pilate had him on trial. And he says, hey, would you like to send him over? You're king up in Galilee. Would you like to see him? Oh, yeah, I'd like to see him. But then as you go on down and read the story, he had heard about the miracles, and he wanted to see him do a trick. He wanted to see, hey, can you do something here? Change something. Do something. And you read of others. There was one of the Herod family who was, he was sort of impressed with John the Baptist. He respected him, knew that he was a man of God, but he himself, that didn't mean he practiced much by way of religion. In fact, when John the Baptist got after him for living with his brother's wife, well, that created trouble and wound up, and John the Baptist lost his head over that. Because, you see, a lot of folks sort of have the idea they're not against religion as long as religion doesn't tell them how to live their lives. But you start telling them you can't do that. The judgment of God's going to come on you if you do so and so. Oh, well, who do you think you are telling me how to live? Well, of course, that's what the Bible's all about, isn't it? So you wind up in the days of Jesus and you've got these various groups. Daniel prophesied, foresaw in advance the set of circumstances that allowed these various groupings to rise up. So in the days of Jesus, you got the Greek language everywhere, virtually universal in that part of the world. That went back to what Daniel had foreseen, the Greek realm occupying it. You had these various groups that had come up basically based on whether the extent to which they went along with the secular world or to what that they took, they reacted to it, sort of the religious right. When you look in the days of Jesus, you find Jesus Christ didn't fit in with any of those. And I think one of the things we see is the potential pitfalls that are easy to wind up in. Jesus didn't do that. He came announcing the gospel of the kingdom of God. There were those by the days of Jesus who had become so angry about the Roman occupation that they were sort of the militia movement of the day. They were called the Zealots. And they were going to overthrow the Romans. Now, in the days of Jesus, they were just a tiny little minority group, but by a generation later, they managed to capitalize on the growing unrest and actually launch a full-scale revolution that took place in the 60s A.D. And actually, some of that sets the stage for the book of Hebrews. As you see, Jesus came and taught and preached, and he ordained apostles and sent them out to teach and preach. Church was raised up in Jerusalem, and you read the story in the book of Acts. And you read about a man by the name of Saul, whose name was changed to Paul, who was an ex-Pharisee. He'd grown up with that background. But he came to recognize that while there were certain things certainly that were correct, the Pharisees believed in the resurrection. They believed in the angelic and the spirit realm. They had certain things that and some of them were obviously much more sincere, and others were utter hypocrites. Not unlike the world in which we live. When you look at the religious world around, a lot of people are turned off by the ones that they see, the hypocrites, who come out and eventually make the front page for having been caught at the wrong place at the wrong time. You find this sort of mentality. The split between those who wanted to fit in with the world around and those who were against it. that colored the world of Jesus' day just like it colors the world of our day. Now, interestingly, as the story comes on through the book of Acts, we end up the book of Acts with Paul's release from prison, which was probably about 61 A.D., and the book of Acts ends. Now, Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us about an event that occurred just a few months later. And that event that occurred just a few months later was the death of James, the brother of Jesus. This was in 62 A.D. James, the brother of Jesus, had presided over the Jerusalem church for almost 30 years. Certainly over, let's say, maybe closer to between 20 and 25, if you want to get technical about it. And there was a transition point in 62 A.D. between governors in Judea, and the new high priest used it as an opportunity to bring about the murder of James, the brother of Jesus. And this had a tremendous impact there. Here was a man who was deeply looked up to and respected even by the Jewish community. Josephus, who was not a Christian but was a Jew, nevertheless referred to James, the brother of Jesus, as James the Just, James the Righteous. And he, in his book, Wars of the Jews, actually ascribes the destruction of Jerusalem that came about 7 years later. He attributed it in part to that murder of a man that any of the religious Jews recognized as being a righteous man. Well, this had a tremendous impact here because this event occurred in 62 A.D., and right at the same time, the militia movement, the Zealot movement, began to come to the fore, and there were all sorts of terrorist raids on the Romans and Roman reprisals against the Zealots, and the situation just continued to get worse to where within about 3 years there was a full-scale revolution that was going on in Judea. And the Romans decided to send extra troops and to come in and to crush it. And the Apostle Paul, writing in the book of Hebrews, I think that the book of Hebrews can be dated right after the death of James. I think that for a couple of reasons. One, Paul makes reference to the fact of it's evidently right after Paul's Roman imprisonment, because in the end of the book of Hebrews in chapter 13, verse 23, he says, "Know you that our brother Timothy is set at liberty, with whom, if he comes shortly, I will see you." So Paul had evidently already been set free, and now Timothy, who had been incarcerated for some period of time, had been set free. And so Paul says, if Timothy gets here soon, then I'm going to come with him and we'll come see you. "Salute those that have the rule over you and all the saints." Verse 24, "They of Italy salute you." So Paul is still in Italy, but he's evidently free. Paul went to Italy in prison, or in chains, went there as a prisoner. So we have to be after the end of the book of Acts, because Paul is still in Italy, and yet Paul is free. And Timothy has been evidently held somewhere for a period of time, has now been let free, and he's coming. Paul says if Timothy hurries up and gets here, then he and I'll both come. So I think the setting here of the book of Hebrews is soon after the end of Paul's Roman imprisonment, and that would put it, if you get just within a few months of the end of Paul's imprisonment, James was dead. I think that understanding that gives an understanding, one, why Paul wrote the book of Hebrews to begin with, and why so much of the issues that he dealt with in the book of Hebrews. You know, he starts out the book of Hebrews dealing with the superiority of Jesus Christ and the priesthood of Christ as opposed to the Levitical priesthood, which was still functioning in Jerusalem. Remember, the Jerusalem church, as had been pointed out to Paul when the last time he had been there about 5 years earlier, James had pointed out the Jerusalem church, said, "You see how many tens of thousands of Jews there are that believe? Myriads of Jews. See how many thousands and thousands of Jews believe, and they're all zealous of the law. And they've heard some things about you. Now we want you to do this, and this will sort of squelch the rumor." Well, it didn't squelch the rumor, because You know, the only way you can squelch a rumor is if people are sincere, if you're dealing with people that are sincere. The ones who were spreading these things about Paul weren't sincere. They didn't want to know the facts of the matter. They just wanted to stir up trouble. And so you remember that story. It's told in the book of Acts. Well, what's about to happen? Things are just about to break loose in Judea within the next 2 to 3 years. And tremendous pressure is then going to be exerted on everyone to go along. Well, Paul goes through and he introduces he's setting the stage in the book of Hebrews for the fact that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, the temple is going to be destroyed, the temple ministry that all these people there have been accustomed to all their life is going to cease. And what are you going to do then? Does that mean it's all over with? No, because we have a high priest, in the heavens. All of the things you've seen on earth are pointing and are types of a heavenly reality. Then Paul begins to get into exhorting them and giving encouragement as you get on through into Hebrews 10 and Hebrews 11, the faith chapter, Hebrews 12, encouragement, pointing them toward the reality. Then in chapter 13, as he concludes, notice, he said in verse 6, well, let's pick it up in verse 5, Hebrews 13:5. Let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I won't fear what man shall do unto me. Then, in verse 7, he says, remember them that have the rule over you, or really the more accurate rendering is remember them that have had the rule over you, who have spoken unto you the word of God, whose faith follow, considering the end of their conduct. I think the reference there, I think that what I just told you fits the context best. Technically, the word could be rendered into English either have or have had. It could be the spelling is the same, and it's sort of a matter of context. But as you look at it, it's talking about looking back to something. Remember. I think the reference here is to James, who had led them for upwards of 25 years. Remember them who've had the rule. Remember those who certainly would have been James and others working with him, but past tense. They told you the truth. They spoke to you the Word of God. Follow their faith, considering the end of their conduct. Again, the indication being that their life is already ended. You've seen the end result of their life. You've seen what they did. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. That's what continues. See, those who led you and guided you, that you looked to and that you respected, they're not there anymore. I don't know that Paul would have written the book of Hebrews in the way that he did if James had still been there, but this had a devastating effect. He says, remember them. They told you the truth. Follow their example. Consider their lives and the end result. And understand that Jesus Christ is the same. He hasn't changed. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Don't be carried away with different and strange doctrines. You see, part of this zealot movement was an attempt to really place an emphasis on the temple, and we're going to kick out the Romans because this defiles the land, and God has given this land to us. And Paul explains here that that we're established by God's grace, not by the offerings that occur in the temple that have not profited them that are occupied therein. We have an altar that they don't have a right to eat of. They've got an altar there in the temple. The physical temple was still there. But we have an altar that the priests that served there in the temple don't have a right to partake of our altar. He talks about Jesus, who, just like the sin offering, suffered outside the gate. Verse 12, the sin offering was the one that was offered outside the gate. Let us, verse 13, go forth therefore unto him outside the camp, bearing his reproach. For here we have no continuing city, but we seek one to come. You see, within a short time of the time that Paul wrote this, over the course of the next perhaps 3 to 4 years, those who were a faithful part of the church had to leave Jerusalem. And they had to leave before everything fell apart, because once it all fell apart, they couldn't have gotten out. He said, we don't have a continuing city here. See, it's easy to get wrapped up. Jerusalem, why, that's God's city. That's where the Messiah is going to rule. Yes, but in this life, we don't have a continuing city. We seek one that's to come. We look to the heavenly Jerusalem. So, Paul is directing and pointing them towards something. Judea erupted in a flame of revolt. The Romans brought in legions, and over the course of 3 to 4 years, between 66 and 70, they began to move through first into the area just east of the Jordan and up into Galilee, and then down on the coast, and ultimately surround Jerusalem, and then began to move in on Jerusalem and lay siege. And there were a couple of times when they had to pull back because of other events going on in the Roman Empire, but that continued on to where Jerusalem was destroyed. Multiple thousands of Jews died. Terrible events that took place. You know, it was the outgrowth of things that had happened. There were those who saw the encroachment of Hellenism. They saw the world's encroachment, and they said, that's wrong. That's right. It was. But you know, many of those who saw that and recognized with it made their own set of compromises. They pursued the solution their own way, and many, particularly of the second and third generation, fell into the trap that so many religious people fall into, of letting religion become a shell and becoming so judgmental and so critical and so self-righteous and so negative that produced what Jesus described and what he rebuked the Pharisees of his day for. You see, there are a lot of different ways to be wrong. There are a lot of different ways to be wrong. There are a lot of different attitudes that will take you the wrong place. There's only one that will take you the right place. You know, Jesus said that the events surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple are clearly used as a type of events of the end time, just before his return. Jesus described that in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21. The events of the destruction of Jerusalem. Daniel foresaw that the Messiah would come, that he would be cut off, that the sanctuary would be destroyed. It happened. Daniel foresaw that before the sanctuary had ever been rebuilt. The thing we have to realize is that many of these things are written and recorded so that we might understand the pitfalls. We might understand the dangers. The world tries to allure and to attract us to come in and compromise and be part of it. That is certainly a serious problem. But you know, a person can react to that and fall into the ditch of a very negative, hypercritical, judgmental attitude such as the Pharisees had. Jesus came not compromising with the world, not buying into Hellenism, not buying into the secular compromises of the day, but he didn't fall into the pitfalls of the, quote, religious right of his day either. He didn't become a Sadducee or a Pharisee, and he certainly didn't become a Herodian. Jesus Christ came with a message, and he's called us to follow him. What we need to understand is that we're living in an increasingly divided nation, and we're going to see some of that division just even grow. We're going to see a time of tremendous pressure and strife. We're going to find all of these things. We're going to see parallels to what many of God's people have faced in times past. And it's good for us to read about it and to realize, what's the answer? Well, it's right here in Hebrews. See, Paul wrote that as a message to the people who were going to live through the things that Jesus mentioned in Matthew 24. Remember in Matthew 24, he's talking. He says, let those in Judea flee to the mountains. That's exactly what the church did at that time. Josephus even records that there was a voice in the temple on Pentecost that said, let us remove hence. You know, to some people it sounded like thunder, and others claimed to have heard words. There were those who left, and there were those who stayed. Those who left fled to the mountains, fled to the area of Pella. Paul is writing to the group of people that are actually going to act on the literal statements Jesus made in Matthew 24. There were a number of people who were alive that were reading this book that Paul wrote, this book of Hebrews, because the events of Jesus' crucifixion had been only just over 30 years earlier. How many of you, look around. How many have been in the church 30 years or more? A lot of these folks been in the church 30 years or close to it. Had been around long enough. They had seen these things take place. And what Paul told them applied to them, but it applies to us. He points us toward a relationship with God. He points us toward an attitude of faith. He points us toward the fact that our ultimate security comes from the fact that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. It doesn't matter what happens in the around, doesn't matter all of these things. Christ hasn't changed. You can count on Him. He said, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. So, we may go through things and we may see all sorts of pressures brought to bear. But Christ will always be available to guide us through. They had lost, at this point, their human leader, James, who had been there for many years. A cousin of his, Simeon, actually took the leadership for the next number of years. But even if James was dead, Jesus Christ wasn't. He was the same yesterday, today, and forever. The resurrected Christ is the one we serve. You see, people, then as now, we always need to have our eyes lifted up to see beyond the around, to see the above, to see what God is doing. And when you see what God is doing, then it puts into perspective all the puny little things that human beings try to do. It puts everything else in perspective when you see God and you see what God is doing. That is our security. That was theirs then, and it's ours today.